The briefing was honest, which I appreciated. Most briefings for assignments like this one softened the relevant facts into a shape that allowed the person receiving them to maintain the kind of optimism required to actually take the assignment. This one did not do that. The Coalition Conflict Resolution Director, a senior Kitharan named Orin, who had the look of someone who had been softening facts for years and had recently stopped, laid everything on the table in the first 10 minutes. 17 mediators over 19 years. None returned. Not killed immediately. The Sorvian civil conflict between the northern and southern factions was not conducted by people who killed messengers on principle. The mediators had been given time. Some of them considerable time. The longest had lasted 4 months before the faction he had been closest to reaching an agreement was decided that the agreement was a strategic disadvantage and eliminated the variable that had been pushing them toward it. A mediator in this conflict was not a neutral party. A mediator was a threat to the faction that was currently winning because the faction that was currently winning was winning a 40-year war and did not want it resolved on terms that reflected 40 years of winning less clearly than 41 years of winning would. The coalition needed someone the factions would not perceive as a threat. They had run out of species whose profile fit that requirement. They tried a human, me, specifically because I had a background in conflict anthropology and a particular professional history that the coalition assessment team had evaluated and described in their recommendation as follows. Demonstrates consistent pattern of being underestimated by parties she engages with no adverse operational outcomes attributable to that underestimation. That was the professional way of saying that people consistently assumed I was less dangerous than I was, and that this had historically worked out well for the missions I was on. I read the assessment and thought about the 17 mediators and said yes. The northern faction held the industrial corridor. The southern faction held the agricultural belt. Both needed what the other had. Both had been taking it by force for 40 years with enough success to make the taking feel preferable to any arrangement that required them to acknowledge the other side's legitimate need for what they controlled. The asymmetry was the problem, not the conflict itself. The asymmetry between what each side understood about their own position and what they understood about the other side's position, which was not nothing, but was also not accurate. Filtered through 40 years of conflict into a picture that served the continuation of the conflict rather than the reality of the situation. I went to the northern faction first, not because they were more approachable, because they had eliminated Mediator 12 through 17, and I wanted to understand what specifically had triggered each elimination before I went to the faction that had eliminated Mediators 1 through 11. The northern faction commander was a senior Sorvian officer named Veth Doran, a woman in her 60s who had been fighting this war for 30 years and who looked at me across the meeting table with the flat assessment of someone who had made peace with the specific calculus of what she was doing and was not interested in having it disturbed. She had agreed to the meeting because the coalition had made continued supply access contingent on it, and supply access was not something she could dismiss. She had not agreed to anything else. I did not ask for anything else in the first meeting. I asked questions. Not about the conflict, about the northern faction's supply situation, their infrastructure maintenance challenges, the specific bottlenecks in their industrial production that they had been working around for years because the agricultural inputs required to maintain the workforce at productive capacity were inconsistent due to the conflict interrupting the supply chains that had existed before it. She answered because the questions were operational, and answering operational questions to a coalition representative had implications for the supply access question, and she was managing that calculation. She answered thoroughly because she was thorough by nature and because the questions were more specific than she had expected, and because answering thoroughly was, I suspected, something she had not been able to do with anyone outside her own command structure for a considerable time. I listened. I went back 4 more times over the next 3 weeks. Each time I asked more specific questions. Each time she answered more thoroughly. By the 4th meeting, she was describing problems in the Northern Corridor infrastructure, with the specific candor of someone who had stopped performing certainty and started talking about the actual situation. I went to the Southern faction in the 3rd week. The Southern faction commander was a senior officer named Kale Soren, a man in his 50s who had inherited this war from his predecessor and who had inherited this war from his predecessor and who had the specific quality of someone who had been fighting something long enough that they had forgotten what not fighting it felt. Porse, he was more suspicious than Veth Doran. He had eliminated Mediators 1 through 11, which meant he had more experience with the process and more established reasons for ending it. I did not ask him about the conflict either. I asked him about the agricultural belt's water management challenges, which were consonant, durable, and about the specific infrastructure gaps that had developed over 40 years of diverting maintenance resources to military operations. He answered carefully at first. By the second meeting, he was answering the way Veth Doran had answered, with the thoroughness of someone who had been managing impossible problems alone for a very long time. In the 5th week, I did something that none of the 17 mediators had done. I showed each of them what I had learned from the other. Not as a negotiating tactic, not as a pressure move. I showed Veth Doran a specific description of the Southern faction's water management crisis that explained something about the Southern faction's military behavior in the Eastern Corridor that she had been misreading as aggression for 11 years. It was not aggression. It was infrastructure desperation. They needed the Eastern Corridor, water access not for strategic advantage, but because, without it, 3 agricultural regions were failing, and the population pressure from those failures was driving military action that looked offensive and was actually defensive. I showed Veth Doran the water management data. She was quiet for a long time. She said she had been reading the Eastern Corridor actions as territorial expansion for 11 years. I said, I know. She said they were protecting failing water infrastructure. I said, yes. She said, if we had not been contesting the Eastern Corridor, they would not have needed to push into our supply lines in the Western Zone. I said that is what the data suggests. She was very quiet. Then I went to Cale Soren and showed him something about the Northern faction's industrial situation that explained something he had been misreading for 8 years. The Northern faction's pressure on the agricultural belt was not resource extraction. It was workforce survival. Their industrial production required specific nutritional inputs to maintain the productivity of their workforce at the level required to keep the industrial corridor functional. Without consistent agricultural supply, their industrial output dropped in ways that created cascading infrastructure failures that had been destabilizing the Northern Corridor in ways the Southern faction had been reading as military buildup. It was not military buildup. It was a population trying to stay alive. Cale Soren looked at the industrial data for a long time. He said the Northern Corridor pressure on our agricultural output was survival economics. I said yes. He said, not strategic accumulation. I said the accumulation was a symptom of the survival pressure. I said, not a strategy. He said, if we had been providing consistent supply, they would not have needed to pressure the border regions. I said, that is what the data suggests. He was quiet in the same way Veth Doran had been quiet. The specific quiet of someone who had been fighting a thing for a very long time and had just seen the thing from a different angle and was discovering that the different angle changed the shape of it considerably. In the 7th week, I asked both of them separately the same question. I asked what they would need from the other side to make a conversation possible. Not a negotiation. Not an agreement. A conversation. The specific first step that was smaller than everything else and could be taken without conceding anything that mattered. Veth Doran said she would need confirmation that the Eastern Corridor water access question was being treated as an infrastructure issue rather than a territorial one. Cale Soren said he would need confirmation that the agricultural supply pressure was being treated as a survival issue rather than an economic one. Both of them separately had described the same thing. They needed the other side to see them acue. Rately, I went back to each of them with what the other had said. Veth Doran said that was not what she had expected. Cale Soren said the same. The first conversation between the Northern and Southern faction commands in 40 years happened in the 9th week, not in a formal setting, in a small room on a neutral waypoint station with 4 people, Veth Doran and her senior infrastructure officer, Cale Soren, and his senior water management specialist. I was in the room. Nobody asked me anything. They talked for 6 hours about water and food, and industrial capacity, and infrastructure maintenance, and the specific practical problems that 40 years of fighting had created, and that 40 years of fighting was preventing them from solving. It was not a peace negotiation. It was 2 groups of people discovering that they had been solving the wrong problem. I sat in the corner and listened and said nothing because nothing needed saying. The formal ceasefire process started 3 weeks later. Orrin called me when the coalition received the joint filing. He said he had been in conflict resolution for 21 years. He said 17 mediators. He said, what did you do differently? I said I did not try to resolve the conflict, I said. I tried to understand it. The resolution came from them once they understood it the same way. He said, you spent 9 weeks asking questions. I said, the questions were the work. I said, the meeting was just what happened when the questions were done. He said, most mediators come in with frameworks and proposals. I said, frameworks and proposals are answers. I said, they had been refusing answers for 40 years. They needed questions first. He was quiet for a moment. He said, the 17 before you. I said they were trying to end the conflict. I said, I was trying to understand why it had continued. Those are different starting points, he said, Anan. The difference was 9 weeks of questions, I said, and the willingness of 2 commanders who were tired, I said. I did not create that willingness, I found it and gave it somewhere to go. He said, you are being modest, I said. I am being accurate, I said. The war was theirs. The exhaustion was theirs. The decision was theirs. I just showed each of them what the other one actually looked like. He said that was enough. I said it was enough. I said it was what was needed, I said, which is not always the same as enough, but this time it was. He was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, the coalition assessment that recommended you described you as someone who was consistently underestimated. I said yes. He said, is that what happened here? I thought about it honestly. I said, Veth Doran and Kale Soren underestimated what 9 weeks of questions from someone they did not perceive as a threat would produce, I said. Yes, he said, and you knew they would. I said, I knew the assessment was accurate, I said. I did not know what would come from it. I just knew that being underestimated meant they would answer honestly. And honest answers were what I needed to find what I was looking for, he said, which was. I said the thing they both needed that they did not know the other one also needed. I said that thing existed before I arrived. I just had to find it. He said the questions were not hard, I said. I just had to be willing to ask them without already knowing the answers. He said most people are not willing to do that. I said no, I said, they are not. He closed the comm, and I sat in my transit cabin on the way back to the outer belt and thought about 17 names and 9 weeks and 2 commanders in a small room discovering that they had been solving the wrong problem for 40 years. The ceasefire was holding. The infrastructure talks were scheduled. The water and the food and the industrial capacity were going to be problems for a long time, and the solutions were going to be slow and incomplete, and occasionally frustrating, but the questions were finally the right questions. That was the beginning. It was always the beginning that mattered most.